one way, actually, as I was thinking about preparing for this panel discussion today, obviously thinking about all the changes that we're witnessing in the environment, particularly regarding climate change, I really had to remind myself to remove myself from the present and move myself as an historian back to the past, and to remind myself that it's easy to think that climate change and associated migrations erupted only in the 20th century. But climate change has a long history here in America, in early American roots as well. So that is the perspective that I take looking at climate change and also migration. So I thought that I would take us back just for a little bit in beginning this panel to early American roots emerging along global commercial and expansion and colonialism in the early modern period that led to population pressures and dealing with conditions of scarcity. So climate change in the early period, changing of the seasons created periodic food shortages that left many people hungry at oftentimes. We know that for between 1750 and 1850, this marked a major transition away from cooler temperatures of the Little Ice Age towards a warmer climate. These changes also brought land failures with unpredictable weather. These changes also posed problems, as you can imagine, for farmers who relied on set patterns to know when to plant and when to harvest their crops. They were under the threat usually of killing frosts that could even come sometimes early summer, even late summer. Also, local climate change was connected to volcanic eruptions that happened around the world and that contributed to food shortages as well. So we know in the late 1780s into the 1790s, Japan and Iceland, there were volcanic eruptions that sent millions of tons of dust into the atmosphere. And as you can imagine, this led to reduction in the amount of sunlight. It led to the lowering of global temperatures and also affecting the food supply. So these climate changes and events also played a role in promoting Western migration, for example. So in the 1790s, shortly after the American Revolution, British troops were removed and Native Americans were removed out of New York. So this made it easier for New Englanders who were significantly affected by some of these volcanic eruptions, made it easier for them. It gave them really an unobstructed path westward. So we know from one observer in Albany in 1795, he actually counted around 500 slaves loaded with personal effects of entire families moving west. They were being displaced west. They were migrating in earnest. We know that here in New York City, the population rose fourfold between 1790 and 1820 to almost 1.4 million, making New York the most populous in the nation. Again, in 1811 to 1818, there's more volcanic activity, this time coming out of Indonesia. This has a global effect, not only on Europe, but on the young United States, resulted in a cold New England, with people reporting that snow and ice covered the area for sometimes for the entire year. This reveals how New England remained part of a globally interdependent environment connected to distant environmental problems across the earth. So why did many of these people pack up and leave during this period, whether it's in the 1790s or even in the early 1800s? Increasing populations against limited land. Some of these migrants were also enticed by flyers to move beyond the East Coast and move into what was known as Spanish Louisiana for new land opportunities there. Transportation methods changed and made it easier for people to move from these climate-infected areas. In 1825, the Erie Canal is completed. Not only does this make it easier for people to move west, but also this facilitates the movement of produce or commodities from the Midwest as well. And as you can imagine, this will undermine New England's agricultural prospects. But we also need to consider climate too. So colder weather, we know, was experienced between 1810 and 1820 in Vermont. Alone 60 towns reported a loss in population. 1816 to 1817, we have a flood of travelers that left New England, fearing that it would become a frigid zone, quote unquote. So people made their way to the rich farmlands of Ohio. In 1820, we know that there was a halt in the Western migration, and this actually coincides with the warmer temperatures. And this occurred for around a full decade. And then this migration begins in the 1830s. And this may have been the result of volcanic eruptions in Nicaragua in 1835. So these events of climate change or natural climate change, if you will, and also that leads to some migration, these events in early US history highlight that climate change, though natural, and migration patterns should be examined across time and also across space and shouldn't be ignored.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. And now I will move on to, and we're just, we didn't explain the panel format before. After each panelist talks briefly, or gives their introductory presentation, we will post some additional questions and open things up to questions from the audience. Please go ahead at any time to type questions that you might have into the chat, and we will address those later as we go on. Gallya, please go ahead.
Okay, so I guess you've kind of set me up very nicely after Mark, because it's true that climate and environmental changes have a long history. However, migration, which is my area of specialty, and climate migration, in fact, have a rather more current history, given the debate that has ensued about who are environmental migrants. Are they refugees? Are they migrants? Which are very, very critical, not only to defining these people, but also to identifying what kind of policy solutions might be available. So I guess my perspective as a political scientist, first and foremost, is to try to understand some of the empirical developments in terms of how climate and migration together have coincided to create very policy relevant types of questions. My perspective in particular, since I am coming from the migration field in itself, is that both climate, environmental issues, and migration are two, in effect, independent factors that together have created a very complex phenomenon that needs to be studied. The issue that I have encountered is that, and happily with a lot of these kind of forum, I can really overcome this, but the issue tends to be that climatologists and scientists that work on this issue are not that versed in migration. And those who are well trained in migration dynamics are not very well versed with the climate sciences and some of the issues, for example, in predicting numbers, types in and of itself. These kinds of matters, whether we're talking about how many environmental migrants there are, or what kind of movements we have, either for damaging further the environment, a precarious environment, or for creating the type of responses from publics that we see in all forms of populism and anti-immigrant reaction. That is the major question I think that policymakers have to ask. If we do not want to address the policy solutions for climate change in themselves, then we need to address the questions of how do we manage international migration. this is really the important question that really comes on the other side. So after I will stop here because I was hoping that my colleague Oleg will talk a little bit, if he wishes, about our common work in the field. But for now, I will defer to our next mentor.
Gallya, thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to have a compelling conversation after when we get to the questions that Nancy is going to ask ask all of you. Javier, you are the other speaker. Are you here right now? Why don't you go ahead and please give us your presentation. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you to you, Jeffrey. Thanks to Nancy. Thanks to Sophie. It's great to be here. And first thing I have to say is that I'm not a specialist in climate migration, but I think, I think I have, some ideas that I would like to share with you, and they can be of interest. I don't know if I can share the screen, or maybe that's going to take. I can just talk. Doesn't matter. So.
I gave you privileges, Javier.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me see. Okay. So I am. This is the cover of my book, and actually the first question with which the book opens is this one, right? How is a desert made, right? How is a desert constructed? Is it possible? So the basic idea is that we understand that a desert is a given, right? But the desert can be also a construction, a result of a process, right? And in my book, what I do is just talk about the role that war had in desertifying or transforming spaces and provoking displacements. But actually, in the source from which this comes is from a Brazilian intellectual, Euclides da Cunha. Several of my students who are here are going to be familiar with what I'm going to say here. He wrote this book, Os Sertões, Rebellion in the Backlands, in 1902. And in this book, he talks about the Sertão, this region of Brazil. And he talks about the relationship between and drought, right? And droughts in that region, right? And he basically says that the construction of the desert is the consequence of contemporary to his writing, land management, right? And in his book, this is I think a brilliant quotation from him. He says, "There is one notable geologic agent that we have overlooked: man. The truth is, man has not infrequently exerted a brutal reaction upon the earth and has assumed throughout the long course of our history the role of a terrible maker of deserts." Right. So, and this is interesting because what he's talking about here is very important. It's a very important element in Brazilian history, Brazilian cultural history too. Is the idea that people who live in this region have been forced to leave. Either going to the Amazon or going to the Brazilian cities because of droughts, periodical droughts, right? And this has been very important in the cultural imaginary of the country. This is a painting by Cândido Portinari, a very important Brazilian painter. These people who migrate within the country in Brazil are called the retirantes. Right, and this is an example, and these are two very important works of literature, very classical works of literature studied in every high school in Brazil, and these are foundational novels who deal with this issue of migration, of climate migration within the country. And this book by Graciliano Ramos translated by as Barren Lives, is also the origin of one of the most classical Brazilian films. It's called also Barren Lives by the director Nelson Pereira dos Santos, which is a story of, and both books are about the stories of families leaving their homes and looking for a new place. So this is, you can see, and now we can fast forward to the present, right? And this is an article from the New York Times from 2021, in which it's basically about the same thing that Euclides da Cunha was talking about more than a century ago. This idea of the spread of barren lands, right? The idea that the Brazilian Northeast is part of this process called desertification that is happening across the planet. It's not just a Brazilian thing. It's happening in very different places, right? And what is going on in the Amazon that we have read about is also part of this desertification, which leads to displacements and migration. So I'm not gonna, just going, let me see if I have, well, and this is just going back to what Nancy was talking about at the beginning, right? I think one of the things important about climate migration is that we have to begin to ask what is to migrate and why people migrate, and ask ourselves that question too, right? But I'll stop here because I think we will discuss more about this in a minute. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Javier. Well, thanks to the three of our panelists for explaining more about your work. I'm going to pose a couple of questions, and just due to us running over time, if there are questions from the audience, go ahead and write those into the chat and we'll work on incorporating them. Kind of one of the first questions that we had posed to panelists, and this is one some of you have already started addressing in what you presented, but is, what are the key questions that you think we need to be asking in order to better understand and approach the issue of climate change migration, or people or areas of study that we need to hear that we are not? So any of you go ahead, any of the panelists go ahead if there's things that you want to respond to that particular question.
Gallya, can you unmute yourself?
That's another thing you learn when you have kids, that you talk to empty space half the time. Okay, so I just really wanted to start actually and tell you a few of the issues that I have been really grappling with, and I suppose that anyone studying climate and migration together as one concept in itself encounters, and that is the problem of terminological classification. So if I wasn't sure as I was setting up today's talk, if I should talk or if I should just answer questions, but when I thought about it, I very quickly thought that at the basic preface of this issue, one has to identify three major questions, and that is, who are climate migrants? Who are they? How do we define them? How do we count them? Data. Right? This is all related. And the third very important related question to the first two are, how do we create very effective policy responses, right? On what basis? So we need to identify, define, and be able to measure them in order to actually be able to have some kind of meaningful policy responses. I just want to say very quickly, I think most people forget in terms of the definition, how complex climate or environmentally induced migrants are to define. And this is why I started by saying this is actually an issue that's become politicized since the 1980s. So that's kind of in the newer phase of globalization beginning. The reason that the definition is so complex is because for migration scholars, we generally tend to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary migrants. in the first round. And we also distinguish between internal migrants and international migrants. On both of these levels, climate migration actually defies our ability to really put them in anything but a gray area. Why aren't they, for example, included in refugees? As some of you who've certainly taken my class might know, that this is really not a acceptable term. This is not a term that actually legally it has been accepted by the international community. And the reason being is that, as some of you who study refugees themselves know, that the definition of refugee has been so limited to the 5167 Geneva Convention definition, which explicitly made refugee protection very much a individualistic, in other words, particularistic type of issue, and specifically it put on the well-founded fear onto only 5 categories of possibilities, all being political. Clearly, environmental migration has nothing to do with, or at least from the opponents, has really nothing to do with a political motive or circumstance for which people are pushed out. And we know for a fact that climate and environmental types of degradations are also democratic. In other words, they equal opportunity, right? They don't necessarily hit a certain race, ethnicity, religion, and so on, of which the language of the Refugee Convention holds. So we could talk about that, the degree that climate migration could perhaps be absorbed. After Katrina, I think it was very obvious that there are certain groups that could say they have particularistic fears. However, what I would say is that the term has never, and I think, maybe I'm a pessimist, will be very much a political issue, and increasingly so, because the institutions that deal with refugees, the UNHCR, and all of their support will be clamoring very hard not to extend the very delicate mission that they have with very limited finances to 30 million more people. So this has to do quite a bit between related to policy, right? If you don't define these people as refugees, we can actually treat them like all migrants, which are voluntary. This is really very problematic and leaves a lot of these people in a gray zone area. I just to move on, I think that this also has a huge implication, and it certainly affects how we collect data and what we know about these people. If they are not refugees, then it's very difficult, of course, to keep data. But if they are internal migrants, we really only can rely on the state. And certainly, since most states are very protective about their sovereignty, the idea that another state will accept for anything but humanitarian basis climate migrants is really very, very low in practicality. So I think that for me, going forward, I think we really, and the smart people here at Stony Brook, really need to get on top of how we work the concepts, the definition, and the data together to create very, very practical policy solutions that deal specifically with climate migration. Again, are they forced migrants, or are they simply economic migrants? We all know that slow onset climate migration doesn't happen really like even certainly, for example, droughts, doesn't happen as war breaking out in Afghanistan. These are not really the types of situations that can create or generate very urgent policy responses. So we need to think about how we can identify those people that are vulnerable so that they don't stay on the sideline as homeless or stateless people.
Thank you, Gallya. Mark or Javier?
Yeah, I was just I was listening to Gallya, and a number of times she mentioned internal migrants, and so once again, as an historian, I think about when I think about internal migrants, I described a few internal migrants in my opening, but the other group that I thought of when I think about internal migrants, particularly here in the United States, are the migrants that were known as the exodusers, as a result of the Dust Bowl, which overlapped the Great Depression. So we know that this happens after 30 years of depleted prairie grasslands, eroded topsoil, and lack of rainfall. And so you have these internal migrants, or these exodusers, that finally decide to leave places like Oklahoma, Arkansas, the southern part of Missouri, Texas, the panhandle of Texas. And because they were enticed by flyers advertising jobs in California and picking crops, so many of these exoduses, they pick up from these states that I just listed, and they begin to pour into California. They're not from other countries. They're Americans, they're former inhabitants of the Great Plains and of the Midwest, who had lost their homes and livelihoods. So when I think about these exodusers, when I think about these individuals that were affected by the Dust Bowl, and a nickname for them would have been Okies, that made their way out to California. The question I came up with, that I was thinking about too, is how do Americans respond to these migrants or these internal migrants that are moving about for economic reasons, for their own livelihood too. So once again, these are American-born Dust Bowl migrants, and they were viewed, when they got to California, even though they're American, they're viewed as intruders in California. They were seen as competing with longtime residents for work. Remember that this is during the Great Depression. Others considered them parasites, quote unquote, who would depend on government relief. So when we think about how do Americans respond to these migrants, not only locals, but also on a national level, and also on a governance level too. Many of these migrants, even though they're Americans, they languish in poverty in camps on the outskirts of California communities. Some locals warned that the newcomers would spread disease and also crime. They advocated harsh measures to keep migrants out or sending them back home. And so one example of that is just when efforts were made to stop these migrants from coming in, because at the high point, we know that around 400,000 migrants headed from the Great Plains and Midwest into California in the 1930s. And as local Californians started to get fed up with all of these people coming into their state and seen as taking away jobs, police sometimes met migrants at the state line, at the border, and told them to go away. They told them that there was no work for them to be had here. Officers, there's one example in an oral history account of an officer stopping one mother who had 6 children at a checkpoint and demanded that she pay $3 for a California's driver's license. And even though she relented, that she only had $3.40 to her name, she needed to buy food, finally the police officer let her go. So once again, I just come back to this question, how do Americans respond to these migrants? And I think we hear the stories of how Americans respond to migrants that come across the border into the United States, but how do Americans, in this particular time with the Dust Bowl, how did Americans respond to migrants that were internal migrants here in the US too?
Thank you very much, Mark. Javier, would you like to speak?
I think one of the questions I think is good to ask is about really the real reasons. I think, for example, Gallya was talking about, right, this difference between like economic migration and climate migration, right? very traditional or very and actually if we ask that question, we will see that many times these are not really different things, right? That one thing explains the other. And I think, well, I think as I work with the stories, I think one of the interesting points in my research has been to find some stories. Mark was referring to some of them too, right? Some about how people tell their own stories, right? About how and why they migrate, right? One important book for me has been the book by Amitabh Ghosh, The Great Derangement, in which he sort of discovers that that he tells his own story about how he understood that he was or his ancestors were originally, he uses the term climate refugees or environmental refugees, right? And he tells the story of his own family in a way about in Bangladesh and how a river made them leave their lands, right? And also, I think it's interesting to ask that question in class and with students. I think that has been I worked sometimes in the class that Gersimran mentions here in his question in the chat. We worked with Professor Davalos with story maps, and which I think is a very interesting tool. And some of the students were telling stories about their own experience of migration, not using their own names or their family names, different names, but creating stories about how and explaining the way in which the migration, the climate forced their families to come to the US, right? I think that was, very inspiring, and one of the positive things, I think we will talk about that too, about the discussing this topic, right, in class. And if I have, I thank a lot Gersimran for his question, which is a very complex one and very complicated. What I can say is that I think this issue about what is going on now about the Amazon, this process also in part of desertification, right? That was mentioned before, and which means also the displacements of peoples, and together with for example, the construction of big dams, etc. I think we can see very clearly how this plays in international politics today, right? I am now in Europe with a fellowship with my in a project about the Amazon, and one of the things that I argued was that talking about the Amazon was really important to understand. Like, for example, we at this moment have this huge free trade agreement between the Mercosur in South America and the European Union, which is basically stopped by the issues that Gersimran is mentioning here about that are going on in the Amazon and with Brazil. It's not exactly about climate migration, but it's a very important issue, and I think I thank a lot Gersimran for his question. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll let my colleagues talk more.
Well, thank you. And so we do have to end this meeting in about 10 minutes, but kind of as a perhaps final question to our panelists, if you would just take, 1 to max 2 minutes just to think about, the problem of climate change can seem despairingly huge and unsolvable. Are there lessons or findings in what you are encountering that give you hope?
Well, I'll start off, and I'll just mention, just looking at the panel today, a political scientist, a professor of Hispanic languages. And so we're looking at this climate change comparatively, but also in a collaborative way. too. And I'm experiencing that as well. Once again, not talking about this Rita Allen Fellowship that I'm on, but it's collaborative work. And I'm working with EDGI, the Environmental Data Governance Institute. And so we're historians, we're geographers, we're public health experts, and some of us are experts in science and technology as well, and society. So what gives me hope is, having collaborative work like this and learning from one another in order to move forward.
I guess I was trying to think about the hope, and I always see myself as a hopeful pessimist. And on this one, I have to say I'm struggling for the hope part, namely because as I look at the issue, the problems that I already mentioned with conceptualizing, dealing with the definitions, data collection, and mostly the ones that really challenge policymakers and trying to adapt to these issues, I see is very, very slow. Most of what I've seen, despite, for example, the very promising, perhaps Scotland recent meetings following the first one following the Paris Treaty, where states have started to think about bringing in migration within the fold of climate discussions. Despite all that, what I see is that at the moment, and this is why it was so important for me to differentiate between internal and international migration, at the moment, environmental migration has no governance, no global governance. There is no international organization that can do very much besides lip service at the moment. Yes, I think that most of the works that come and trying to collect the data and getting more studies going come from the internally displaced people organizations at the UN and other nation state level. Most of what we really need to do is to try to get migration and climate together in a global framework. And instead, what we have are a number of parallel ad hoc almost institutions that really are vying for some kind of mission. Imagine that the people that are working on migration come from justice and home affairs and security and all kinds of policymaking at that level of border control, whereas the people that need to be looking at the science of climate, that look at the processes, are really at different ends, even within the governance structure. So I think that coordination, international coordination, is the key to managing both of these issues. But the pessimism comes from me because I clearly understand that national sovereignty becomes really a very key stumbling block for any of the nation states, especially the advanced industrialized countries, to actually coordinate. And we have to think about this. Is this an issue that basically is about asymmetry, right? They're advanced industrialized countries who really feel like they're taking on the brunt of climate, environmental issues, and migrants. Are they the ones that could actually find a way, like in the refugee scenario, of perhaps making link deals where countries that can afford to really gain better leverage on climate might be able to either fund more of the changes or agree to the kind of steps that countries like Sweden have, which is to take on, to have national programs to admit peoples that are fleeing because of their lives being in jeopardy of environmental issues. I think that this is really the question that I would ask before I could give you a future scenario. But I do want to end whatever I say by bringing in, this is a perfect way to plug in the work that Professor Oleg Smirnov and I, as well as a few other climatologists and marine biologists, have worked very hard over the last few years. They have produced all kinds of models on drought that show the level of migration depending on emissions regulations that are mitigating it can offer. So numbers, projections help. The problem on the other side is projections also create fear mongering. So we need to really think about how we sell and brand this issue for the publics who are bound to see enormous amount of increase.
Gallya, I'm just going to jump in here because I think we're going to be cut off in a minute, and I want to give Javier.
Absolutely, because if you cut off in my talk again, I will definitely take it personally. So, okay.
In about 2.5 minutes. Okay.
So Javier,
forgive us if it gets
equal. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, I just want to say what I was suggesting before. I think a good thing we can do, and that is can be as a way to help us better understand what is really climate migration and how real and close to us can be, is to listen to stories, right? This is also what I do, right? Learn to listen. By listening what people have to tell, we can discover, I think, a lot of really how this is really close, and telling them also, right? Sharing them. I think that's a good thing. We can something important, I think, to better understand this issue.
I want to thank again Gallya, Mark, Javier for your presentations and your participation in this panel. This was a great conversation and an important one to have. We do have questions in chat, but come to the panel 2, which will be on March 9th. We won't have Zoom problems then, I promise you. And we will, particularly the 2 questions we have in chat, please come to the panel and ask those questions. We will have time for your questions to be addressed. Okay, so Nancy, anything you want to say? No? Okay.
Thanks to all for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for your hard work. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and see you next month.
Okay.